So good morning and welcome everybody to the webinar on subject access requests and deadlines and winning the race against time that are being kindly hosted by Liz Smith and Ralph O'Brien, two people that I'm sure you've heard of and are familiar with in the data protection world. Just going to run through a couple of housekeeping things before we start. Questions. If you do have any questions during the session, please can use the chat function and we'll address them during the session. We are recording this webinar, so if you do miss something, you can go back and watch it later. The only personal data that will be on the webinar are the hosts' names and information. The chat is not shared or anything else, so you don't need to worry about that. The webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, although I have been informed that Liz and Ralph both do like to chat, so I will be trying to rein them in a little bit nearer the end. Any follow-up materials, recordings and additional resources are going to be shared with you via email over the next few days. And at the end of the webinar, we will be sending out a survey. We really do appreciate you taking the time to complete it, as it does help us shape the kind of webinars that we're going to be running in the future, and not only how the format of them and how they take place, but also if you can highlight any material or subject areas that you'd be really interested in finding out about. So let me introduce you to Ralph O'Brien and Elizabeth or Liz Smith, and I will let them take over. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Crystal. Much appreciated. So this is where we say hello from me and hello from you. We'll start by just telling us a little bit about who we are and where we come from, and I promise I'm not going to take up the whole hour with that. So my name's Ralph O'Brien, for those people that don't know me. And I guess I've been working in data protection now since 1998, so that makes this my 27th year in data protection. I think it is you get less for murder, I think is the expression. That's made me work for lots of organizations, and as a DPO and as an internal data protection advisor through public sector organizations, all the way through to large corporate, setting up data protection programs in multinationals like Apple, Kellogg's, Huawei, TripAdvisor, to name but a few. I'm now a consultant and trainer, and very much enjoy and am honoured to have been asked to do this from DPAS.
Well, I'm not sure I can follow that really, Ralph. My name's Liz Smith, for those of you who don't know me. I've been working in privacy. I'm a relatively newcomer actually to the space. I became involved in data protection in 2019, so only 6 years, although my background is very much financial services compliance in all forms, so that included data protection. I'm senior privacy consultant for an organisation called DataGuard, and between you and me, Ralph is one of my privacy heroes.
She always
so I'm delighted to be here
try and
today.
embarrass me, just to try and knock me off my perch when I begin.
Yeah, absolutely, Ralph, absolutely.
But we got some content for you today, really about subject access requests, and sort of trying to give you a little bit of a guide, because there's been actually some interesting court cases come out recently. But actually it's worth revisiting the basics. It's always worth starting with the basics. So Liz, perhaps I'll hand over to you and we'll start talking about tick clock, along comes the clock, right?
Precious time is slipping away with a D, so I think that'd be a really good line for a Van Morrison song, don't you?
Yes.
But when to start the clock? It's really important when you get a data subject access request in, or any data subject request, to know when to start the clock. And so the clock starts the day the request comes in, not necessarily the day that you pick it up. So what I mean by that is, if the request comes in on a Saturday morning, the clock starts on the Saturday morning, not Monday or Tuesday if it's a bank holiday weekend. So it's really important to get that clock ticking from the day it's received. If it's over Christmas, if it comes in on Christmas Day and you're off until the 3rd of January, you haven't got 10 days grace. You have to start the clock back on the 25th of December.
Yeah, I always think it's really interesting looking at the way the timings work, because what we've really got is the words in the legislation, and the words in the legislation says without undue delay and in any event less than a calendar month. And I think a lot of people miss the without undue delay. In fact,
Yeah.
whenever I train data protection and I train somebody else, I say, how long have you got to have to answer an access request or any individual rights request for that matter? And everyone says, oh, calendar month. And then I say, no, that's not what it says. And they said, no, it says a calendar month. And no, it says without undue delay within a calendar month. So to me, that means as soon as possible. And so what I'm starting to look at, especially in large global organizations where you don't have a lot of sort of subjective decision making, is the possibility to begin to automate requests. Why can't an individual log into an app and press a button? That's always been my concern. I know that's beyond the technology levels of of certain people, and certainly if we're going to have some human interaction to decide what and when we're going to send, that might not be possible. But for sort of lower level access requests, when an individual just wants, a transaction history or a printout of what's on the customer deadline, I mean, why can't it be instant? I mean, I've actually got very low capability or any concern with with individuals that say, "Oh my God, this is so complicated." When, a lot of data protection says minimize what you hold. Don't hold as much. And the simpler you keep your processing,
Yeah.
that can kind of save you. There's a reason why when people go into court cases, they, always start with a shredder, right? So that's sort of the timing. What the law says is it says without undue delay, within a calendar month, but if it's complex, you can take an extra 2. So what's a complex request then, Liz?
So complex doesn't mean that you've got lots of personal data on somebody.
Yeah, that's on you.
Yeah, complex. Yeah, should you have it? Should you be keeping it that long? I would say, and also just because the employee, let's just say it's an employee data subject access request, because I think they're the ones that people focus on. If that employee's worked for you for 15 years, do you really need to give that information to the employee? Complex doesn't mean lots of data. It doesn't mean that you've got lots of processors involved in the request either. If you've engaged lots of processors to do the processing for you, sorry, I've just seen what I do. Watch this space. Sorry, Ralph, got carried away. That doesn't make it complex. Complex is when we come to actually looking at what data you hold. Where is your data? How are you going to redact it? And part of this, I think, comes down to the triage when it first comes in. When you get that request in, take a minute, record it. Okay, what have we got? What are we asking? Is this complex? Why do we think it's complex? Can we justify whether it's complex?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I watched a great presentation from Ashley Winton, who a lot of people will know, and
Yeah.
he actually did a presentation on the fact that, as a lawyer, what can I do to frustrate the process? Which was a really interesting conversation to have. So I think that's kind of fascinating. What is a complex request? Well,
Yeah.
just because your processing is complex doesn't make the request complex.
No.
If you've got a lot of personal data, that's on you. I always struggle and say, oh, we've got loads of stuff in emails. Well, I've got customers who are in the sales provision, who every time they send an email to a customer, attach that email to the customer record. And so they never need to look in their email system because the emails are filed in the right place with the customer, right? And I know that's beyond the technical capabilities of some, but the technology we've got these days allows you to do things like that. Take that email and instead of storing it in your communication system, store it with the customer data, so that everything is in a nice package and can be picked up in a more automated way. Now, I've just seen a couple of people saying, "Oh, when does the clock start in terms of identification?" Now that's a really interesting thing. It doesn't say identification in the law. It says that it is a defence for the for the controller to be able to say no if they can't authenticate who the individual is, because obviously you don't want to give the wrong data to the wrong person. So that's
And
really
with a name like Smith, that's quite easy to do.
Yeah, Liz Smith, Ralph O'Brien isn't actually unique. There was Ralph
Oh,
O'Brien.
you are, Ralph, you are.
There's a basketball player and a country and western singer in the US who shares my name. So, but I'm not a John Smith, I'm not a Singh Patel, right? But actually what can be quite interesting is, it says authenticate. Now, it doesn't say ask for ID. And I've always had this argument with organizations. It was Amazon, actually. I went to Amazon and put in a subject access request. And Amazon came back and said, oh, great, send me your passport driving license. And I said, why? And they
Mm.
said, well, to authenticate who you are. And I said, but it's funny, when I want to buy something from you, you don't do that. And that's a business as usual transaction. A subject access request to me is a business as usual transaction. There is actually no legal difference between a subject access request and somebody going to an app and saying, what's the balance on my bank account? There's no legal difference. There's
And
no,
as well, so, sorry, Ralph.
no, there's no legal difference between a rectification request and somebody phoning up the bank and saying, can I change my address?
Yeah.
So what do you consider as business as usual that you're going to empower your customer services teams to deliver? And what then requires escalation to a data protection team? I've always found that a fascinating decision.
And if you were going to collect that additional ID, then that's another process you need to record. Why are you collecting it? How long are you going to keep it? Where are you going to store it? Who's got access to it? So asking for passport and driving license adds a whole nother level of processing for your data mapping.
Yeah, you're essentially collecting excessive information.
Yeah.
I actually said to Amazon, what's your relationship with the passport office? And they said, well, we don't have one. I said, then why are you asking for my passport? What are you checking it against?
Yeah.
We've got an agreed way to authenticate myself, username and password, or you could ask me the last few digits of my credit card number, or send me a PIN to my mobile phone, or ask me what my last few transactions was. There are plenty of ways to authenticate someone. And as Haley's on the line. Hello, Haley. It's just very kindly pointed out. What if you don't go on holiday and drive?
Yeah.
So we don't have a national ID card in this country. So moving on slightly then, the idea of subject access and individual rights requests in general is, we're going to need to start keeping internal records. And actually, when people put in erasure requests, we call this the Streisand effect, because, even when someone puts in a erasure request, you're then obliged to keep a record that you've complied with it. So, you kind of create a record on the person whose data you're deleting, which is really interesting, right? And Neil's just put in, our applicants aren't signed up to an account or app, so it isn't as simple as a bank login. Totally get that. In some cases, you will have to ask for ID if you don't have any prior relationship with the individual. I'm just saying that shouldn't be your default go-to when you do have a decent relationship.
And if you do, make sure that ID isn't excessive.
Totally, exactly.
Yeah.
So keep records. What sort of records do we need to keep, Liz?
So I'd be keeping a record of, firstly, the date it came in, what decisions I've made about it, the date of receipt, how I verified ID if I feel I needed to, the communications log, the communication I've had with that data subject. Have I phoned them to see what they actually want, to ascertain what they're getting to? Any internal decision making that I've done, any decisions that we've made, this is what we're going to do, this is what we're not going to do. I would keep a copy of my final response. Redaction logs is something that comes up, Rolf. What's your thought on redaction logs?
Redaction logs. So by redaction logs, you're saying the data you don't give to the individual. So yeah, there's a process with subject access, and that process is going to be, you're going to need to authenticate who they are and make sure you've got a valid request. When you have got a valid request, you need to communicate that out to the data subject, because actually they could think that the timer started 3 weeks ago, but actually the timer only starts when you've got all the information you need to actually find the data and the request begins. So you need to inform them and communicate very quickly, right? The timer started as far as we're concerned from today, not 3 weeks ago or whenever.
And keep that recorded.
Exactly. So then moving on to redactions, of course, the next thing you've got to do is go and find the data, have the data brought back to you, which happens in seconds, right? The data lands.
If only.
The data lands back on your desk, because our records management is so good, it just lands back on your desk immediately. But then you've got to go through that data and, as you say, sift to look for any exemptions or redactions that you might want to apply. And so it becomes imperative, because these are the times where you're going to get the argument, right? If somebody comes back and says, "Or why did you delete that?" or "I don't agree with that redaction," you're going to have a record there of what the original looked like, what you sent to the individual, and the reasons why you've made that redaction or delta or decided not to disclose in that particular case. So, whole list of exemptions, and actually the exemptions
Yeah,
get quite complex because you've got Article 23 of the GDPR enacted through Schedules 2, 3, and 4 of the Data Protection Act 2018. And some of those schedules apply to subject access, some of those schedules apply wider, but you've got a number of exemptions in there that we probably haven't got time to go through today. But I personally do believe that you need to understand what data you're looking for, what data you've got, what data you've got back in. So, it's a whole load of dates. The date I asked for it, the date it came back in, the date I looked at it, the date I redacted it, the date I sent it to the data subject. Those sorts of dates and times is going to become your timeline. And that's when a lot of people opt for having some sort of database or systematic way of doing this, where they keep
yeah.
some sort of centralized log of what they did and when on any individual write request, let alone a subject access request.
I agree with that, Rolf. And I think when we look at keeping those records, that's quite often in a privacy platform, privacy program management platform, as is your data mapping. And to know what data you've got and where it is, you need to be going back to Europa's, seeing what you've got where. And this is where people underestimate the power of your data mapping in Europa's.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, we've got some interesting questions on this online. Are you supposed to request it from the IT department? Well, yes and no. I mean, Liz just mentioned your data inventory, the ROPA, that's the summary of the data inventory, that, wherever the data is, the data might be held in processors,
Yeah,
third parties, the data might be held in manual format locally, it might be in audio tape, CCTV, but yes, I mean, your IT department is going to have a much better idea of where the data is, but hopefully, have you have done your homework properly? Have you done your data inventory work? It should just be as easy as looking it up and knowing where that is. I think a lot of the problem is we've sort of lost control of information a little bit, and therefore data kind of is thrown up and landed everywhere, and therefore why you not what a lot of people find I don't do within their data inventories is kind of outline what their systems of record are, what I call the single source of truth.
yeah,
Then there might be copies of the data in other places in different formats, but where is your single source of
yeah.
truth, in terms of what is the true and real central source of data as opposed to all the copies you're going to find everywhere else? And Martina's just added what team or department should manage the SAR process. Well, again, it's going to depend how many you've got and who you are, right?
Yeah,
I've worked in the police, and in the police, they literally have a disclosure division where they deal with any request. And when I'm talking about not just data protection here, FOI, environmental, requests from the press and media, they actually have a disclosure division that deals with all this stuff. But equally, I know other organizations that don't have the data protection teams dealing with this. They actually empower their customer services teams because they're the people who deal with and make the amendments to the customer records. So it's largely going to depend on how many you've got, what you're going to empower your frontline customer services teams to do, and also how complex they are, because you might need a second line expert to look at them as well.
this comes back to your triage when it first comes in. Who is this request coming from? Is it from one of our customers? Is it from one of our contacts? Is it from one of our employees or ex-employees? Who is the best person to manage this request?
Yeah, that can be quite an interesting one. I mean, Martina's there saying that she's from the general HR team. So, again, there's going to be a difference in dealing with a request from someone who's a member of staff or a disgruntled member of staff or an employee or a disgruntled person who fails to get a job in your organization to a customer request, So, understanding who your data subjects are, understanding who your stakeholders are, the different sources and the numbers of these things you're going to get. You might even need a different process for your HR requests than your
Yeah,
customer requests, definitely.
yeah,
And that's another thing you need to record, because I find quite a lot of people get caught out because when the manager, I say to people, what metrics and measurements do your management ask for? And the management, they say, well, often they don't. You know, they say, oh, I don't want to breach. And I say, well, you know, how do you report your success or failure of something that may or may not have happened? I, I,
Yeah.
I actually think you're better to report to your management all the cool stuff you have done, all the evidence of all the stuff that you've done that's given them return on investment. And certainly one of the things you can report quarterly or yearly, depending on how much you get and how interested the management is the number and the quality of the requests. How many did we get? How long did it take to respond? And what quality, you know, what sort of feedback have we got on what we've sent out? Did you, I mean, what sort of numbers? I mean, what sort of numbers? Because, you know, Liz, I mean, in your experience, because, you know, I deal with organizations that have never had a subject access request, and equally organizations that deal with, you know, sort of a few hundred a month, you know, so.
Yeah. I mean, it varies. As a consultant at the moment, I'm working with one organisation that has, as you say, several hundred a month, and a lot of them are routine, and we know what they're dealing with. Another organisation I'm working with has had their first one this week,
So
and so
panic.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things is when we talk about stopping the clock, inaction, panic, or being immobilized by getting the first one doesn't count as being a reason to stop the clock.
No,
You
exactly.
need to be thinking ahead and, okay, what if I did get one? What would I do? And almost live the journey, thinking forwards, imagining it to get it documented. Now, when you do get one, because you will at some point, you can then look at your process, look at your policy and say, did it work? Where did we go wrong in our documentation? Where do we need to tweak all this and bring it in line so that we've got something that actually works and reflects what we do?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a bit of a disaster story actually, in that one of my clients was a national children's nurseries, and they actually had video recording within the nurseries to make sure that the staff in those nurseries weren't doing anything horrible. And they'd never had a subject access request, not one. And then one of their staff got accused of doing something horrible, roughly around the same time the GDPR arrived.
Right.
And so, you know, you had this perfect storm of a staff being accused of doing something horrible at the same time that everybody was now being made aware that they had these, you know, rights that I mean, they did have before, but, you know, you have to remember here that this is not new to the GDPR. We've had the right of access since the 84 Act.
Yeah.
So, you know, you know, we've had this for 40 years now, right?
It's not new, is it?
No, no, no. I mean, the rules have changed slightly, but, you know, but then they went from none to 300 a month and asking for video of their children in the nursery.
Mm.
So how would you go from ramping up from having none to having to deal with 300,
No.
which also includes technical redaction, because you're
Yeah,
not
yeah,
redacting paper-based records there. You're isolating a child from others on video, you know, which is, you know, really, really difficult thing to do.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Should HR be dealing with a request from a member of staff, or should it be done independently? And well, you know, these things are always a collaboration. You know, I would say you need a collaboration between HR and data protection. Somebody also said on the question there that you know, that they work in the public sector and they've got, you know, healthcare professionals making healthcare decisions. Well, clearly data protection and the business unit are going to have to work together, because data protection might know what the law say, but, you know, can I claim that exemption? What's the individual circumstance? Is somebody going to be put at risk of harm? Well, only the business knows that. So it's probably going to have to be a combination of people at that
Yeah.
point.
Yeah. And I think that's probably wise, Rolf, particularly when it is HR, because
Mhm.
then you can demonstrate independence and oversight. There is no skewed view from an HR team or an HR manager who may have made a decision that's not popular, shall we say.
I had a beautiful rights request the other day, which was it was actually a rectification request, because someone had called someone lazy in their appraisal. And it was a really interesting one because, you know, the person said, I can objectively prove I'm not lazy. I want it removed. So we had the question of, do we remove the inaccurate information, or do we keep it on the fact that it is an accurate recording of an inaccurate opinion?
Or is it an inaccurate opinion? You might think I'm lazy, Ralph. I might think you're lazy. other people might think otherwise.
I do want to, I do want to point out, if Liz is talking about laziness, the amount of paperwork that Liz did in preparation for this webinar compared to me. So, so you know, we can turn laziness around there, I think, Liz. I mean,
I
we've
think
sorry, we've talked
sorry.
about redaction, Liz, but perhaps you can explain what redaction is and how you would go about doing it.
Yeah, and I think it links into that thought on opinion there as well. So redaction. Definition: removing, obscuring, or masking information to prevent disclosure of content that a data subject is not legally entitled to see. And I think that legally entitled to see is something to bear in mind and really important. We have to think that the data that we hold on an individual may also contain data of another party. And so just because that the data subject access request comes in from John and something in the records references Janet, John should not see Janet's information, and vice versa.
Yes, so we need to protect third parties. That's an obvious source. Though some people extend that to members of staff, and actually we have to remember that members of staff are, generally speaking, not acting in their personal capacity as a data subject. They're, they're normally acting as a member of staff on behalf of the data controller. So, you know, we might argue then that actually, you know, it's not personal data in terms of you know, it relates to the individual because it relates to them as a member of staff in that capacity. So whilst I would redact, you know, other data subjects, I might not redact member of staff unless I had a fear of them coming to harm.
Yeah. So that's protecting the rights and freedoms again, isn't it?
Yes.
And you made an interesting point when we were talking the other day, Ralph, about what the GDPR says about privacy and rights and freedoms.
But it doesn't say anything about privacy. That's the point.
No, precisely that, and people forget that.
Yeah, I mean a lot of people forget that the main focus. In fact, the GDPR's got two reasons for existing. Number one, protecting the rights and freedoms of natural people when processing data. Number two, making sure the free flow of that data. You know, people actually think about the GDPR as something that stops data movement, but the idea is to allow data movement. God, we've got hundreds of questions. I'm kind of falling behind here. You know, so we've got a few people talk about are notebooks included? Well, when you look at the material scope of the GDPR, it talks about a relevant filing system. So the question is that notebook a filing system? And you can go back to the old Durrant case here, which kind of talks about it wasn't structured in any criteria that related to Mr. Durrant. So, you know, a lot of people say that in a notebook, for example, where you just record the date and time of a phone call and you write a load of stuff about a person and then turn the page over and then do a new page for a new day, you could argue that's not a relevant filing system because there's no intention to add that to the customer record. You would bin your notebook and there is no intention for those notes to ever form part of a customer record. However, in the public sector, they actually don't have that exemption. It's specifically written into our Data Protection Act, not the GDPR, that the public sector cannot claim the exemption for you know, unstructured manual records. So in answer to your question, I think that was Ian, you know, are notebooks counted? Well, it depends. If you're public sector, yes. If they're a relevant manual filing system, yes. If they are not structured in any way that relate to the individual and you're in the private sector, no. So, you know, it does get slightly complex when we're looking at sort of manual records, so to speak. A couple of other questions here. Would you redact the subject line in recipient's email? I don't think so if they're acting as the member of staff, but Liz, would you say different?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't. No.
Providing a summary of the data rather than the documents itself. I don't agree with that. It does say a copy of the data very clearly in the law.
Yeah.
And also the other thing that I would add to that is we have to remember when looking at the GDPR Article 15 that it's not just a copy of the data. There is a whole list of, if I call it metadata, but it essentially starts off and it says, hey, a person shall be entitled to understand if processing is taking place, and if so, the following information: the purposes, the legal basis, the rights they have, recipients, if it's gone to third countries, where they got it from, how long you're going to keep it for, amongst others. And
Yep.
then only then it says a copy of the data. So a copy of the data is actually mentioned quite a long way down the list. So many people focus on the copy of the data and forget to give the data about the data that they're going to need to claim further rights requests.
And this can link back into that call or that communication at the outset with the data subject. What is it they want? What are they actually trying to get to?
Yeah, that's interesting. You know, if a person only asks for a limited amount of data, you only have to give them the limited amount of data.
Yeah.
But technically, you're not allowed to ask why. Technically,
No, motive is irrelevant.
technically you're not allowed to reduce the scope by sort of saying what you really want. So if they ask for all personal data, that's what you've got to do. Louis says it's a copy of the data, not the document. But I would argue, it's the personal data elements that are within that document, right? Which is probably going to be a lot of it.
Ralph, you mentioned the articles there. You just referenced Article 15. It might be helpful just to say which articles are relevant for people to be able to look up at a later date.
Yeah,
Because I think quite often people are scared by GDPR.
yeah,
But if you take each bit in each article in its simple format, just read that. It gives you so much information. It's not complex. It's the big thing.
yeah.
It's the whole book that people get scared of. But if you just look at one article at a time, there's so much information there.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, you don't have to worry about the 173 recitals at the beginning. In a way,
How
you don't
many?
have 173.
How
In a
many of
way,
them do you quote in your sleep, Ralph?
yeah, exactly. In a way, you don't have to worry about anything over Article 50 because that's really on member states and things like that.
Yeah.
So it's really only Article 1 to 50 you've got to understand. And the terms and definitions are sort of 1 to 10. Rights are sort of 12 to 23. Obligations of controller 24 to 39. And then, codes of conduct and international transfers 40 to 50. So when it comes to subject access, you've really got to understand the terms and definitions. What is personal data? What isn't personal data?
Yep.
You've got to understand Article 12, which is the rules on putting in a rights request. And then you've got to understand Article 15, which tells you what you've got to give them. And then finally, you need to go to our Data Protection Act and look at the schedules in the back end, 2, 3, and 4, which look at exemptions, essentially. There you go.
So when you break it down like that, actually, if you go and read those articles,
Yeah.
you're not
And
going to
it
go
doesn't
far
even
wrong, are
matter
you?
what I say, what Liz says, what the ICO says. The law is the law. So
Yeah.
you've got to, argue the law. There's people saying clarifying all data requests, or if they say all personal data you process, then that's it, I'm afraid. Can you really go back to them and say, what do you really want? Well, no, you can go back to them and say enough information to help me find it. So I think it's
Yes.
reasonable if it's a CCTV request to kind of go back and say, when was I on the CCTV? And if I don't have a relationship with you and you just pass by one day, I'm not going to search every bit of CCTV. That's unreasonable. So I can come back and say, what do you look like? What day? What time? So I can ask for enough information to narrow the request if I don't know you. But if I do know you, when you're just saying all personal data, I don't think you can go back to someone and say, what you really want. I need, because that's narrowing the scope again. Their right is for all personal data. And if you hold lots of personal data, that's on you, not them. Your bad filing system is not their problem. I hate to say it.
Good quote. Good quote.
Yeah.
I think that there's a case on the ICO website, isn't there, where they talk about a doctor's surgery where there was somebody who was a receptionist, left the role, became a patient, was also a carer for elderly parents registered at that same practice, and their children were registered at that practice. That individual put in a data subject access request, and so it was okay to go back and say, which of these channels, which role do you want, or do you want everything? Have you seen that one on the ICO website, Ralph?
I have indeed. I have indeed that request. So yeah, what role does somebody play and what relationship do you have with them? Hillary's put in a fantastic point. You can have a lot of data and it can be legitimate. Yeah, I agree with that too.
Yeah.
But
Of
yeah,
course.
yeah, you can have a lot of legitimate data on somebody. You know, there is the principle of data minimization, but yeah, if you've got a lot of data, that means you've got a lot of obligation here. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the sad thing, right? When could a request be deemed manifestly unfounded? Well, or excessive? Well, there are ways out, aren't they? You know, can a request be unfounded? Well, if they're doing it for the wrong purpose, not that you're allowed to ask what the purpose is, which is the problem. And if it's excessive, really, that's about repetition, not about the amount of data.
Yeah.
You know, I would say just because you've got a lot of data doesn't make their request excessive. It's really if they're asking for it every week and the data hasn't changed. That's where I'd say the excessive kicks in. It's more about, you know, their amount and frequency of request than it is about the amount of data you hold. So, you know, so yeah. So every DSAR is, as Liz put it, tells a story. We've got some really interesting case law that's kind of come into play recently. I think the most recent one is Mike Ashley. Now, I'm not going to get into who Mike Ashley is and what people's opinions of him are, or else we might be here for a very long time. Um, but in this case, Mike Ashley went back to HMRC, who had basically, there was a tax dispute between him and some of the properties he owned at HMRC. He put in a SAR, and HMRC provided some limited, heavily redacted data, refused a lot of the requests, citing a lot of exemptions from the Data Protection Act. What did the courts think about that, Liz?
I don't know, Ralph, you tell me, because I've been looking at deer.
Okay, okay, fine. I will let you do deer then. So it's a really important judgment because it's one of the few times the court's actually ruled on how and why a controller has to respond to a DSAR. Another one to look at here is Harrison versus Cameron. But it was interesting. They confirmed that a broad request requires a broad search. So not just specific departments. If someone says all data HMRC holds on me, it shouldn't just be, you know, that element they were dealing with. It's the whole of the organization, which means you need a good data inventory to know where that data is. They looked at the definition of personal data, including relates to, and HMRC had taken a very interesting approach there, and they said, oh, this is data about the property, not data about Mike Ashley. And so they said, well, it doesn't relate to Mike Ashley because it's about the property rather than Mike Ashley. Well, it's to do with Ashley's taxation on that property, and therefore it's clearly linked to him. So the court said, look, you can't withhold it because it's about the property, because it materially affects the taxation he has to pay. So that property is linked to the individual, i.e. it relates back to the individual, you know, in this case. So they talk about direct relating and indirect relating. So they mentioned the word continuum of relevance, which I thought was a really interesting. So again, proportionality. You know, sometimes things will not be relevant, sometimes things will be relevant and related to somebody. So you know, again, you know, basically they're saying case by case. And then they started to talk about the search. So a reasonable and proportionate search. And so reasonable and proportionate search. So, you know, unfounded can be a really interesting sort of word. And some people are commenting on it in the chat window here. Sort of unreasonable or crossed a line, or they're doing it to be malicious or vexatious for a bad reason. That's what unfounded is really there for, is if you're trying to badger or upset the organization. You've already frustrated the complaints thing, and now you're going after subject access because, you know, you're not really, you know, subject access really exists for you to then move your other data rights forwards, you know, not to find evidence for a legal case or not to annoy the organization. So even though you're not allowed to ask them why, I think, you know, if you've got a troublesome customer who you suspect is doing it just to badger or annoy the organization, you know, that's sort of unfounded. But then you have to understand what a search would be. The court made clear in this case that when replying to a DSAR, would it be sort of disproportionate? And controllers can consider the time it would take to fully reply, including redacting data, applying any exemptions. Many controller often just consider the time it only take to search for data. So, what is a reasonable and proportionate search and response time? HMRC, rather than, while they supported Mike Ashley through saying how much data he should have received, and he should have received a lot more, they kind of supported HMRC in terms of what a reasonable and proportionate search is. And then finally, they kind of went back and supported Mike Ashley again with the amount of data provided, because the data that was provided was narrow, it was insufficient, and it didn't have any context with it. And I think that's really interesting, because the courts confirmed that the controller not only has got to provide a copy of the data, but also contextual information to help people understand the data. I've always thought of Crystal as a 22ZZ91, whereas Liz, you're more of a 32L11C.
Thanks.
You know what I'm saying, right? If you're going to use internal abbreviations, internal codes, if you're going to, what does that mean for the data subject? Just sometimes a copy of the data isn't enough. You've got to explain what that data means, and what that means to the data subject and how it would affect them. And I think that's why it becomes so important, not just to give a copy of the data, but also that metadata. And
Yes.
and another failing I see there is sometimes people just give another copy of the privacy notice, and actually that's not really what it says. It's about my data and how my data has been used, not just a general copy of the privacy notice. So just something to kind of consider there. So moving on to Dear. Sorry, let's move on to Dear.
No, I'm glad you did that one, Ralph, because I couldn't have unpacked that one as well as you did. So, Dr. Dear. Dr. Dear was a lecturer, I believe, at Oxford University. And Rachel Dear, there was a dispute over the termination of her post at the university. And she was looking to make a claim, a tribunal claim, and put in multiple data subject access requests. The university then argued that she only wanted the information for her legal battle and not to understand how her personal data was processed by Oxford University. But the court ruled, as we've spoken already, that motive alone is not a valid reason to refuse a data subject access request. A request is a request, irrespective of the motive. And that's really important to remember. The university also claimed that the burden of complying with the excessive number of requests and the scope of the requests, plus the volume of the documentation, was just too heavy, and that they didn't need to respond. The court ruled that reasonable and proportionate efforts should be made, but you don't have to make exhaustive searches, but you must justify the limits that you apply. So I think anything that you're doing, it comes back to that record keeping and documentation of the decisions that you make. Burden of proof is on the organisation, so you have to be prepared to justify that should the ICO or a court come and ask.
Yeah, counter argument. If your record keeping is so bad that you can't find things quickly and easily, why are you holding it in the first place?
Yeah.
If you've got, people say that the exemption for disproportionate effort is there, so you don't have to look in every desk drawer. And I agree with that. You go to your filing system, you look at your files. You go to your system of record, you look at your system of record. You don't have to look in every desk drawer just in case. But my argument is, why would you be holding information anywhere else than your than your systems of record?
And back full circle, what's your data map say? What
Yeah.
have you got documented in your data mapping, your inventory, your records of processing? What's there? That comes back to being a cornerstone for me in any privacy program.
Yeah, definitely. And I think Neil's put an interesting one. What's in the best interest of the data subject is interesting sometimes, because you can even end up with subject access requests when it's not the individual making the request. It can be a parent or a guardian. It could be a legal representative of somebody, or somebody's carer, or somebody who lacks the capacity, a vulnerable person. And so there, we can fall back on, someone said exactly what I was about to say, the Caldecott principles as well, so especially in healthcare, so you've got to think what's in the best interest of the individual sometimes. And I've even seen people redact things that people even gave them, and I'm like, well, why? They know who their account manager is, they know who they dealt with, they know who their line manager is, They know what information they gave, so why would you redact that? It's an interesting one.
Yeah.
But you know,
That comes back, it's interesting as well on redaction, isn't it? Is that you can't redact information just to be kind. Oh, I think Ralph won't like that, so I'll redact it. So
yeah,
where is that?
yeah, I mean, and then you have to actually be careful, because actually there is a criminal offence in our data protection law, a personal liability criminal offence, which is the destruction or the removal or the barring of data to prevent disclosure to a data subject. So, you know, we have to very carefully keep to our procedures here, because otherwise, you know, if we, you know, in an unauthorized manner, you know, remove something, I mean, and the way I used to have it explained to me was this: say I'd gone to somebody's file and I picked up somebody's file in order to answer a subject access request, and some idiot had put a post-it note on that file, attached the post-it note on that front that says, "This person's a bloody idiot, don't deal with them." Now, that's kind of attached to the file. It would be very easy to remove that post-it note and put it in the bin and nobody would ever know. But have you deliberately taken something off somebody's file with the intent for it to not be disclosed to the data subject? I
You
think
can
I
you
think
can take it back one stage further. What was the purpose of that note?
it's a really important note. I mean, even
Yeah.
though, you know, the fact that somebody has attached something to their file to say, "Don't deal with this person, they're an a-hole," you know, I actually think that's the exact sort of piece of data that the data subject will want and need to know about. I mean, all right, it's the smoking gun, and you could argue removing it is going to save everyone a lot of hassle, but that could be a personal liability criminal offence. You know, removing data with the exact intention as to not disclose it to the data subject. Yeah, Sue's just wrote in the comment, "There's no exemption for embarrassment."
Absolutely. Yeah.
Going back to my police days, I once had a police officer describe this woman as mad as a box of frogs, when what he should have said is, in my non-professional opinion, this woman is suffering from signs of mental instability, and this is the evidence why I think so. But he wrote mad as a box of frogs. Well, we
Was
had
it me, Ralph?
no. Of course, we would have had to do a disclosure. We did disclose that at the time, you know. Yeah, so there's no exemption for embarrassment or indeed kindness, you know, and it becomes really interesting, really interesting. So, yeah, there are exemptions if it's health, social care, and education, and it will cause serious harm to the individual, however. So, you know, but again, how do we know that is the data protection team? That often means going and talking to the business units themselves
Yeah.
and sort of understanding that kind of element. So moving on to
And
oh, sorry, go ahead, Liz.
no, I was just going to say, going back to scoping out your process and what you do before a data subject access request comes in. As Jane said, you know, those exemptions are there for health, social care, education, anything that might cause serious harm. Get that documented so you know the data you're processing and what you would do if one of the requests had those types of content.
I mean, moving on to kind of top tips, and I'll come back to the labour reprimand because this kind of ties into my top tips, I guess. You know, my top tips is that the principles and the process will save you here. You know, you're going to need a subject access and indeed wider individual rights request process. You're going to have to take some decisions on who you empower to answer. You know, is it the customer services team? Is it the business teams? You know, when do you need to escalate to a data protection team?
Yeah.
What can I do in a more automated way to give people access and self-service, as opposed to going, you know, the more complicated public sector stuff where you might need redaction. You know, if it's literally just a bank and you're saying, "I've made these transactions on this account," yeah, that can be done through an app, right? But you know, when you need human empathy and humans to understand and start making decisions about judgment, you know, of harm and risk, that's when you're going to need a manual process, right? And so you've kind of got this sort of idea about, you know, what can I automate, what can I have manual. You're going to need a process either way, and you're going to need people to be very clear on what happens when they get one. Bear in mind, they don't even have to mention the GDPR or data protection. Just have to say, "Hey, I want a copy of my data." How you're going to do that, either in an automated way or in a manual way, what you're going to empower other people to do, and what you're going to need guidance and more of a legalistic approach upon, or more of a when you're going to use those redactions and when you're going to treat it as an escalation to data protection teams. And then going back to this Labour Party request, I mean, this is when we start talking about keeping records and statistics for the accountability to prove that you're doing the right thing. Now, we all know we've got an ICO in the UK who, let's face it, is slightly less fierce about enforcement than others.
Nicely put.
Yeah, and who would rather write you a letter and say sort it out than otherwise. But what the ICO is doing, or you could argue they're doing some quite bad enforcement, but they are issuing reprimands. These are naming and shaming, right? Naming and shaming. And the one we're going to draw your attention to today is the Labour Party. This is 28th of August last year. 28th of August last year. 352 subject access requests. 78% not within 3 months. Now, that's not even without undue delay. That's not even 1 calendar month. That's 3 months. So now we're looking not a normal one, complex ones. But I would argue that 352 weren't complex. I would argue that 99% of them were probably normal subject access requests that needed a request without undue delay. So 78% not received a response, over half, 56%, over a year. 150 complaints they received.
Yep.
So 150 of those 352 put in complaints to the Labour Party. There is an inbox where Data Protection Act, Privacy Act, that had not been monitored by the organisation since November 21. So they hadn't even been reading the fact they had these requests. And then in that inbox, there was an additional 646 SARs and 597 erasure requests, which just hadn't been looked at. So to be fair to the Labour Party here, I mean, they have aligned with the ICO, had discussions with the ICO, and agreed a sort of a plan to address the backlog, which includes assigning 3 more members of staff just to tackle the outstanding requests, funds, and action plan. So they are working with the ICO to try and get through their backlog. But this does outline that yes, the ICO could be considered as fairly asleep at the wheel, but actually, if you do start to slip into bad effects, it could be that you get a letter from the regulator or a reprimand. They are certainly, ready to take some sort of action for bad actors or for people who have kind of slipped behind here as well.
And when you get in lots in, Ralph, I'm all about the OMS. I'm not a T, but I'm the OMS of data protection and privacy. That recording things so that you know when things have come in. When you've got one, it's easy to remember, oh yeah, that came in a week ago last Wednesday. But when you've got multiple requests coming in, get that recording straight away so that you know what timeframes you're working to, you know what your capacity is, you know when you need to start pulling in extra resources.
Yeah.
When you've got 646, you're never going to remember which one came in when.
Yeah, it's structure, process, appropriate resourcing, the principles, having the right records in the right place, knowing what are your systems of record and your systems of truth. People asking a couple of questions here about capacity. Well, how you assess mental capacity, I'm afraid I'm going to refer you to your more clinical side here if you're in healthcare. Mental capacity of an individual or a child is that you're going to have to go to your clinical teams there as opposed to your data protection teams. There is some interesting guidance around third-party requests as well. So we are starting to see a rise in third-party companies that are going to individuals and saying, oh, I'll put in a erasure request and subject access request for you for a price. And then they write to you and say, I'm writing to you on behalf of who's, contracted with us to put in subject access requests on our behalf. But by the way, you've got to use our portal and we're not going to let you talk to the data subject. Now, the ICO has been pretty clear on their guidance there that, realistically, you wanted to have some dialogue with the data subject. You want the data subject to understand they can do it for free and not at a price. And generally speaking, these companies, if they require you to register on some sort of portal, don't do it. That's been pretty much the ICO's response, and write back to them very politely and say, we're quite happy to send it to the data subject, but and you are within your capacity to act as an agent, but we're under no requirement to register on your portal. So that can be an interesting balancing act as well when you get these third-party companies who are trying to automate the process. And then that can cause you to have, if they're going to automate, and technology is in their hands, then I suggest you do as well. If technology is the problem, sometimes technology can be the solution, right?
And then that's your data sitting somewhere else other than the place of where you requested it from. Somebody else has now got your data.
Yeah, you're just introducing another third party. So Martin has put an interesting question here. Should organizations have a formal policy and clearly defined retention period for storing emails? Yes.
Full stop.
Full stop. I mean, the only thing I'd say about emails is remember that emails is not necessarily a system of record. As I've said, I've got sales organizations, and what they do is when they send a communication to a customer, they take that email and put it on the customer record. That way they can delete their emails almost whenever they like, because actually any important information is stored with the customer, right? Email should not really be a system of record. They should be a communication tool. So the more we can think about, centralizing the customer records around the customer is better. Liz, complex request. What's a complex request?
Complex request, sensitive information, making disclosures, anything needing legal advice. Those would be my guiding factors. Something that you need to really seriously think about.
Yeah. Different to the norm. We have to remember these subject access requests should be considered as a business as usual process.
Yes.
I've had people saying, "Oh, everyone we get is complex." Well, no, they're just subject access requests. But if something is somehow different from normal, so be it. If the amount of data someone put it is 10 gigabytes, do we have a legal basis to minimize that? No, you're holding 10 gigabytes. That's
why are you holding it? What have you
why
got?
are you holding 10 gigabytes? And
what's your retention policy?
Yeah, exactly. So
how do you justify those timelines in your retention policy?
The other principles will save you. Listen, we could go on forever, but I appreciate it's 2 minutes to the hour. The ICO does have some brilliant guidance, so always go and look at that guidance.
Yeah, agreed.
But also remember, the law is the law. The ICO does not make the law. The law is the law. Article 12, Article 15, the principles, the exemptions in the back end of the Data Protection Act are your friend here. It's been an absolute pleasure. And Crystal, we're going to hand back over to you to close, I think.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, I'd just like to thank Liz and Ralph for a really, really interesting hour talking about subject access requests. I mean, I certainly learned a few things there. And also the questions that people were providing were really great and made much more interactive session, which is always really fabulous. So just to let you know that the session today was brought to you by the Data Privacy Advisory Service, DPAS. We offer a variety of training courses and also consultancy services and outsourced data protection officer roles. We're going to be sending you a link or an email with the session and also a feedback form so that we can get some information from you around the sort of things you would like to see in the future around webinars. Once again, thank you, Liz and Ralph, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks, Crystal. Thanks everyone for joining.